Hey everyone, and welcome to this video on how to structure your React project. Now we're going to be looking at folder organization, how to organize your components, and just generally where to put stuff in your React app. It comes from best practices, it comes from my own experience, and it comes from just seeing how I've seen things done elsewhere in other apps. Now, because React is a library, it's a very subjective library, and there's a lot of subjective best practices that may work for you and they may not. So what I'm going to go through is what works for me and what I've used, but to be clear, there is no one way of doing this. So take everything I say with a pinch of salt, and the same goes for everybody else. So hopefully this information is useful, but let's jump right into it and see how to organize your React project. So let's get started. So I've created a blank React project called React Project Organization. Super unique name, very creative, because that's just how I roll. We have, your standard fanfare here, your node modules, which we can practically ignore. That's fine where it is. The public folder, the source folder, and then just some root files, which is all good. Now the public folder is where your static assets are going to live. This is what gets used when you build a project, and your React app will essentially be here. We've just changed the title, and you can change other things in here, and this will get built when you build the project. You can put images in here. You can put your PWA manifest. You can put your robots.txt, which will be basically how your website gets read by Google bots. So you could say you disallow it, and all the other good stuff that comes with robots.txt. So we can ignore that for now. There's not much to that we can do really, aside from just editing a few things. So it's not super important right now. Now the source folder is very, very important in a React project. This is where your presentation layer essentially lives. And you can see here that they've just given us all the starter files, loads of tests. So we've got app.test.js, and we've got setup test, and just some other things. We don't really need too much. We've even got a logo, SVG, and then the app.js stuff. Now we're not going to touch too much of this. I'm just going to show you how we're going to organize on top of the starter stuff. So we're actually just going to leave all of this where it is, even though it pains me to see it so disorganized. We're going to go here and we're going to create our first folder, and it's a very important folder. It will be our components folder. Now this is where our components are going to live, our UI components, and each one is going to have a capitalized folder. So for example, if we create a button component, within that we'll need to add some files, but before we do, I just want to let you know that if you ever see a capitalized folder like this in a React app, it generally means it's a component, and it's to signal to other devs that this is going to be an exported component, and it's probably going to have a default export along with it. So that's one of the biggest reasons why people capitalize their component folders. So let's go in here and create a new file. Now we want to create our button.jsx. So this will be our button component. And then we also want to create an index.js file. Now the way this is going to work is this index is going to basically be the first starting point for this component folder. So whenever you do an import, it's just going to go to this file straight away by default, and it automatically won't go to the button.jsx file, so you're going to have to do some weird imports. Otherwise you'd have to do something like this, so something like component/button/button, whereas with the index file, with this index file, you just need to do that, and it just makes life a lot easier. So let's go here, and let's just create a really quick component. We'll just say button. We'll make it a fat arrow function, and we'll just add some fragments, and we'll just say button and just put test here or something. You know, really simple. Oops. Just a really simple component. And then we're going to export by default the button component, and that should be fine. And then let's export the default export from the button folder. And what that does is that basically goes to button and takes whatever the default export is in that and then exports that from the index.js. So it's kind of Chinese whispers a little bit, but it just means that we have those better imports, and the button folder itself has this default export coming from it. And this is something that I use quite a lot. So within our button folder, we also tend to add some styling. So we could have a button.css or .sass, whatever you fancy using. We haven't set up Sass in this project, so we'll just use button.sass, and then we'll just import that here. We also generally don't capitalize our CSS files because they're not default exports and they're not components, but they are of components. It's up to you. It's down to preference. If you want to capitalize them, you can do. I just tend not to, but everything else is generally capitalized. And it also helps differentiate between the button files and the CSS files. Another file you can create is actually the container file. So it's more of an old practice, and it's more used for class components, just generally because with class components, you have to write a lot of complex state logic for your components. And what this does is this kind of separates it into a different layer and kind of handles all that complex logic here. So what you would have is complex state logic or other different types of logic that would go here, and it would just basically wrap your button component. Because we're using functional components, and because we will be using hooks, we don't actually need this. But if you are using class components, then this is something that you probably will need. And even with functional components and hooks, people still tend to use this. So if you're using something like Redux, or if you're using RxJS to stream data or feed data to your component, then yeah, this is also another good place to do all of that. It's usually used in larger apps where you want to separate that type of logic and you don't want everything in there. If you are using Typescript, another good file to have in your components folder could be a types file. So for example, a button.type.ts, for example. So within here, you would do something like, so you would say export button types, and then you would have in here like text string or class name string, you know, something like that. You'd basically be passing these props and the types for button types in here. So you could also put your TypeScript types in here. But if you're not using TypeScript, then you don't need to worry about this. But this is just kind of a flavor of some of the things that you could start adding. You could add a Storybooks file here where you can add your stories for Storybook. So it's a really good way to check your components in real time and actually test them and play around with them and develop them. And that's one really good thing about Storybook if you've never used it before. So I think we kind of get the idea of the components folder. Now let's just create a new one. Now this one was made very popular by Next.js. Now Next.js popularized the idea that if you put something in your pages folder, if you put a component here, it would automatically create a root for it. And that's the idea with pages, the pages folder. So if you have separate pages within your website, so for example, if you had an about page, or if you had a contact page, so if you had any pages like this, you would essentially add a component here that would act as the contact page, and then you would add your other UI components from your components here into here, and then create a page, and then also set a root. So that's one of the good reasons to have a pages folder, because that is essentially where your pages on your React app will be going if you're not doing a single page application or an SPA. So we'll leave that there. I'd highly recommend checking out what the pages folder is, how it works in React apps in reference to the history of Next.js and what it did to popularize that practice. Another really good one is to create a Utils folder. Now, a Utils folder is a great place to have a home for all your helper functions. So for example, if you want to create a media query function, so for example, if you want to create a custom hook, called media query, you can do. So you've got here a helper file that we've just created, and you can use this throughout the site wherever you need it, whether you want to set a media query in your React project or whatever you want to do, whatever helper function you want to create, you can just basically bung them in here. Some people even put util folders within their components if they've got particularly large components, just to localize the helper functions. But if you have shared helper functions that you use throughout your React app, then this is another good place to put it. Another good folder, and I think it doesn't really need much explanation, is a fonts folder. Another one is either a styles folder, so you could call it styles, or you could simply just call it Sass if you're specifically using Sass. It's totally up to you. I think just to be a bit more neutral, we can just put styles. Oops, I've created a file called styles. Create a folder called styles. And then within here, you will just put your global Sass files or something. So you can put your global Sass stuff in there. And then obviously you've got your index file here. So this will be your home for your project. If you're creating a component library, this is where you'll export all your other components. As a React app, this is where you basically have the entry point of your website. So that's all fine there. The rest of this stuff you can pretty much delete. You can even create an assets folder. So this assets folder will contain images and all kinds of other things that you're going to use in your components. In your public folder, if you've got images for your static assets for your public folders that aren't used by your components, then you should put them in here. So then you create an assets folder in here, and then you can put images, and then you could put, we'll just put this in there, and you can always organize them however you want. We'll delete that. You can create an images folder and pop it in there. We're not quite done yet. We do have one folder which is actually outside of here, and that is in regards to Storybook, because I do highly recommend you check out Storybook. Storybook is a really great way to view your components in an isolated environment where you can just prod and poke, tweak and change and mess around with all the different settings. And it's something that I use professionally every day. So always introduce this into your React project, small or large. It's super helpful. So in that vein, I'd always create a Storybook folder, and within that would be all your settings for your Storybook that you put into here to tweak the Webpack settings or whatever it is that you want to do. And obviously everything else here would be your root files. So obviously things like your readme, your package.json, your package lock, if you're using TypeScript. So your webpack config.js would go here. If you're using Babel, your Babel RC file would go here, so on and so forth. And this is pretty much how I organize my React projects. I find this to be the most effective way to organize small and large applications. There are obviously more nuanced ways to tackle all of these issues. The more technologies you bring on, the more things you have to consider. But for a straightforward React application, or a component library or a UI kit, whatever you're creating, something like this goes a long way. And there you go. That's how I would personally organize a React project. Now, if you found this useful, please do make sure to like and subscribe. It really does support the channel. My name's been Harry though, and this has been Curious Byte.